We are live. Cool. All right. So, as some of you know, my name is Lewis Adams Dunstan. I work for Darwin Recruitment, and I run a series of webinars focused on the wonderful world of AI. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Mr. Rian Whitton. Rian has a master's in science and security from King's College of London, and currently is a senior analyst and ABI researcher with a focus on the field of robotics and automation. Ryan's also a board member and advisor for the Exoskeleton Trade Association. So today we're actually going to be talking about the current economic state, aka COVID-19, and the effects that this has actually had on the robotics industry. So welcome, Ryan.
Hi, Lewis. Pleasure to be here.
So Ryan, I was hoping you might be able to give the audience a slightly deeper dive into what it is that you guys specifically do at ABI Research.
Yeah, thanks. So just a quick background. So I've been at ABI Research for around 3 years. ABI is a market intelligence company that focuses specifically on strategic technologies with a long development horizon of about 10 to 20 years. So strategic technologies like 5G, AR, VR, AI, machine learning, and of course, my particular field, robotics. And within the field of robotics, and this depends very much on the taxonomy people are using for robotics, we're focusing primarily on industrial robotics, commercial robots, mobile robots, a little less at the consumer space, and not so much at things like RPA. So we are focusing very much on physical robotics.
Okay, awesome. So I think, it goes without saying, it's a pretty interesting time generally for every industry sector. And having seen how things are moving within AI, I personally think if there was a better time for robots to become more prevalent in the industry and the market, it would be now, where people don't have the ability to actually kind of work together physically, or at least closely, where there's a huge influx of need in warehouses and places where robots can really like speed up the actual process. That kind of stuff was happening before COVID-19, but I guess from your perspective, where was we pre-COVID-19?
Yeah, so since around 2012, the robotics industry has been on a definitively upward curve, especially since Amazon bought Kiva Systems and really started implementing mobile robotics into its supply chain. Beyond that, we've also had very steady growth and in some cases very strong growth in the industrial robotics market. This relates particularly to China and the Far East, where there's been just a massive increase in the use of robotics, especially in their manufacturing sector, a result of the fact that wages rising quite significantly there, and there's a lot of need to increase productivity in those economies so that they can start competing with the more developed economies like Japan and South Korea and Singapore that already have very large installed bases of robots. Since 2015 as well, I'd say that investment in robotics had been going up, to a very high level. There'd been a huge amount of venture capital directed towards the self-driving car space. Virtually every major automaker had been picking and choosing their various startups that was going to provide them autonomous vehicle technology. There's been huge investment in surgical robots. The Da Vinci robot is a specific example of that. And there's also been huge sort of fluctuating interest in other subfields of robotics, commercial drones, mobile robotics for the supply chain. There's just been a huge upward curve in interest in robotics. Now, this is starting from a very low base. The robotics industry globally still accounts for probably less annual turnover than the larger, than one Fortune 500 company, probably sub 50 billion. So we're not talking about a massive industry at this point, but it was definitely on an upward curve. A lot of companies were unprofitable, and there were some major casualties, but nothing you wouldn't necessarily expect from sort of quite a growing, fluctuating area. So in a sense, prior to COVID-19, and especially in 2019, there was a bit of a leveling off in the shipments for industrial robots, in part caused by macroeconomic slowdowns in manufacturing, particularly related to the trade war. So a lot of industrial robotics vendors struggled. The investment increased, but was located and situated in a much smaller cluster of companies, with much fewer new companies being created, especially in things like the self-driving car space. But broadly speaking, we are still on a massive upward curve when it comes to commercial and industrial robotics.
Right. Okay. I think from where I sit as a recruiter, I definitely saw less focus towards the tail end of the year. Autonomous vehicles seem to be something that popped up more and more, certainly in Boston and San Francisco. But with COVID-19 in mind, then how has that disrupted the robotics market and that kind of upward curve that you mentioned we were kind of on?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the autonomous vehicle space, I mean, for one thing, that market has some major questions that it has to answer um, regardless of COVID-19. That has enormous investment with virtually no revenue and no actual dedicated business model. A lot of the people developing this technology are, in effect, open to whoever can make a business model out of the technology they're providing. Another issue that they're coming into, focus is the issue of improving their safety models. Now, the idea was that the safety models for navigation for autonomous vehicles on the road would match Moore's law, that it would just exponentially increase.
Right.
What's actually happened is that as the models have got more sophisticated, the edge cases have got harder to create and replicate, and it's become much more expensive to develop better data that you can then feed in to improve this model. So the actual cost of improving these systems has increased markedly. And already prior to COVID-19, there were casualties. COVID-19 basically suspended all testing of autonomous vehicles in California from the get-go, because the vast majority of these vehicles still require a driver in the vehicle. There's only two companies that are registered to deploy completely driverless vehicles in California, Neuro and Waymo, and they have continued testing, but most other companies have had to suspend it. And at the same time, some companies like Starsky have gone out of business. So the self-driving car space, I think, is in a state of real not peril, but flux, and there will be considerable casualties, because one thing that this likely recession will bring into focus is the profitability of these robotics companies, and too many, I'm afraid, have significant investment and have relied so extensively on VC and corporate subsidies without actually finding a road to profitability. Now, that's not just a problem with robotics. That's also a problem with Uber, with WeWork. There are so many Silicon Valley companies that are, frankly, very exposed to a recession. And they've largely been able to survive because of the sort of fair weather climate we've been in. I think this recession is going to probably create some second order effects in the tech industry, which will see a lot of players burn quite severely. Now, moving on to industrial robotics, there is going to be a massive shortfall in the first half of the year. China is obviously the largest manufacturer in the world, and it's got the largest single install base of robots. The two major industries for the industrial robotics market are the automotive manufacturing space and electronics, including smartphone devices. Now, in China, in Q1, I think the shortfall in automotive sales was about 80%. They're expecting about a 5% drop for the whole year. And when it comes to electronic devices, as much as half of the revenue could be lost due to COVID-19. Even when and if China gets back online, which they say they are when it comes to manufacturing capacity, they still have to deal with a much lower demand in the United States and in the developed world. So those two markets are really going to manufacture, and you will probably see a subsequent shortfall in industrial robotic sales, at least in the short term. In the long term, they probably have a much rosier future, because all this money has just been thrown into the economy, either through fiscal stimulus or just through sheer liquidity, to the point where capex and capital expenditures in capital equipment is very likely to increase in the long term. But yeah, there's no doubt that at least to a large segment of the robotics industry, COVID-19 has been incredibly disruptive, for the first quarter. If you look at consumer robotics as well, I mean, their forecast for the growth pattern for this year has been totally thrown out the window. We're talking about the consumer vacuums. But that's the short term. I think COVID-19 in the long term is going to be, sort of counterintuitively quite beneficial to the robotics industry and to the automation of various practices in general.
Sure. So is there anyone that you know of? I'm not sure if you can mention specific names, but that's been genuinely negatively affected. Businesses that perhaps were front runners in the space that are just not going to be able to compete anymore.
Well, I wouldn't say there's no one that's not going to be able to compete anymore. I mean, most. Look, there's just a lot of startups in the robotic space. They're all heavily exposed, and virtually none of them make a profit. So, there's definitely going to be casualties. However, I think, if you look at the industrial robotics vendors, the KUKAs, the FANUCs, the ABBs, I mean, they've struggled with, the robotic sales, for a good, 2 or 3 years, at the least. So, in a sense, I'm not sure the decline will be that significant for them. It won't be that much of a change from what's gone on. I think, we're definitely going to see casualties, but probably too early at this stage to say that there's some specific vendors that are going to be out of business by month's end.
Yeah, sure. I guess on the flip side of that question, then, like, is there anyone that you've obviously seen that's been positively affected by this? I mean, no one's been positively affected, but from a business perspective, being able to actually benefit from how things are moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably the most interesting thing about sort of COVID-19. I mean, the economic response, the public response, it's on a scale that we haven't really seen. Arguably since World War II, with looking at the level of nations and private business, and crisis does create opportunities for things that were previously impossible to take place quite quickly. This isn't robotics, but if you look at telehealth and just sort of teleoperations in the health sector, or just digitization of the workplace. I mean, in a sense, you might think that COVID-19 might put a lot of CTOs and digital transformation VPs out of jobs because it's managed to, basically, change the way we work in a matter of weeks, whereby previously CTOs were giving like roadmaps for 5 or 10 years. So it's definitely changed things very quickly. I think if we're going to look at the robotics companies and the robotics applications that are going to benefit from COVID-19 and the response to it, there's the immediate public response to COVID-19, and then there's the wider kind of economic impact. I think if you look at the first order effect, if you look at the health response, you see robots that have been equipped with ultraviolet lights, which basically go around a hospital and basically use the UV lights to disinfect the facility to kill about 99.9% of germs. And obviously, in the case of COVID, you have massive pressure put on hospitals, and you have a major problem that generally when hospitals get busy, the infection rate at hospitals can very often skyrocket, and that often leads to a lot of extra surplus unnecessary deaths. So the fact that these robots were there and they were only brought to market quite recently is really a sign of sort of the industry sort of ingenuity and success. And these systems, about 2,000 of them have been ordered from Denmark, where the main company building them is based, to China. That's 2,000 sort of quite expensive robots already shipped to China. There are about 19,000 major hospitals globally. So they're clearly going to increase their installed base and become from suddenly a very niche technology to quite ubiquitous across hospitals in a very short space of time. You then have other applications related to cleaning and decontamination, robots that spread hydrogen peroxide on trains and public transport. They're being tested out at an increased rate. You have disinfection being delivered via drone in places like Wuhan, and then if you keep on the theme of cleaning and maintenance, there's actually, well, prior to COVID, there was a big increase in the number of robots used to do floor scrubbing in retail stores. Um,
Yeah, I've seen loads of them. Yeah,
yeah,
certainly out here in America.
yeah, absolutely, and it's pretty much the norm. I mean, we're talking about thousands,
Yeah.
considerably faster growing than the self-driving car space or robots in virtually any public setting. And they're actually, because COVID is obviously creating a lot of anxiety, and a big part of a retailer's job, especially in brick and mortar retail, is to actually make cleaning a much higher priority, to document it, to make sure that it's rigorous, to make sure that it meets all necessary standards, and the robot, not far from just alleviating the labor shortage or just being convenient, actually collects a lot of data, which is then used to monitor the cleanliness of the store. And so those applications are going to increase as well. Yeah, so that's cleaning and maintenance. Then you also have robots for material handling. Last mile delivery is obviously some, it's a part of the supply chain where the additional costs are very high, and so tech companies are focusing very heavily on reducing costs there.
Yep.
One potential way to do that is through automation, and you've seen companies like Starship Technologies, they've set up in Milton Keynes in the UK. It's a very kind of linear, easy city to direct a robot or to build an automation system around. They already have an operation there where about 1,800 people are served by these robots, and about, some people might use that robot for delivery of groceries, pizza, 200 times a year, and that's being expanded to encompass medical supplies. I mean, you've got Chinese logistics giants doing that in Wuhan. You've got autonomous shuttles delivering medical supplies to clinics in Florida. You've got Neuro doing grocery testing in California. So, and this is part of COVID-19. It has opened up a lot of public space whereby robot pilot testing now is considerably easier. And the question is, when and if everything goes back to normal, and these operations are still going on, if they are sufficiently safe, it's not like you're just going to be able to turn the clock back on them. They will, in some form or another, still be there.
So should people be worried then that post COVID-19, that although they're not working right now, if this does work and they are really efficient, that you might have to reskill, or those jobs that were available to you before might not be available anymore because
Yeah, I mean, the question of robots taking away jobs, I mean, it's there's a lot of conflicting literature on it. I mean, my personal view is that if you tend to look at the periods where employment grows the most, it generally is those periods where productivity increases the most. Companies that see productivity increases because they've deployed capital equipment and robots and automation tend to be much more eager to hire than those that don't invest in capital equipment and rely on very cheap labor. So I would not be particularly worried about last mile delivery vehicles taking away jobs. A lot of this is not necessarily ready to be commercialized at a mass scale. You're still going to, it's considerably more difficult to operate these systems than people tend to give credit. I mean, obviously, a lot of people in the leisure industry find themselves unemployed at the moment. I think about 16 million workers in the US have filed for unemployment as of now. A large number of those jobs will bounce back and be covered. And we've got to remember the scale of the robot deployments. We're talking at most the hundreds, maybe into the thousands, but this is not going to be millions of shipments at this point. We're still at a very nascent stage of development. But I think you also, another big application is intelligence monitoring and surveillance. Thermal cameras have skyrocketed in shipments, primarily because they're useful for detecting temperature, and companies are using it to monitor their workers, and very often these are being deployed on drones or on robotic vehicles. Drones are also being equipped with loudspeakers to give instructions to the populace. I mean, about a quarter of the world's population is now under quarantine and lockdown. So keeping tabs on that and monitoring that is obviously a very big job.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from your perspective or your opinion, what do you think the long-term impact of the pandemic on robots and automation is going to be?
Yeah, so I think this comes to the second point, that the long-term economic impacts, I think, portend very well for robotics. I mean, in 2003, there was a SARS outbreak in China, and this led to a massive surge in online retail in a country which at that point was still, you know, not even, I think that it wasn't even the fourth largest economy in the world, let alone the second. And that really catalyzed the growth of Alibaba and JD.com and these
Yeah,
enormous e-retailers in China that now compete with Amazon for market share. Um, at the same, I think COVID-19 will have a similar effect, but on a much larger scale. And when you look at the increase in orders for companies like Amazon, who've had to limit their SKUs just so that they can keep up with demand,
yeah,
a big part of dealing with that increased demand comes in the form of higher throughput through automation, through automated storage and retrieval, through AGVs, and through more flexible mobile robotics. Uh, and we're looking at some companies that are offering automation solutions for the warehouse, but they're seeing their demand double at this time. Um, you know, and this will obviously, I think most of the growth will be in the warehouse at this point. I think warehouse robotics will see generally an uptick from this crisis, but this will reverberate throughout the supply chain. I mean, you are going to see last mile delivery done to an extent that it hasn't been done before. I mean, we're at hundreds of delivery vehicles at the moment, probably. We're going to be in the thousands and tens of thousands in the not too distant future. The same with floor scrubbing and cleaning. Now, I think when you look at the history of recessions, generally they are followed by a large increase in automation, and just the sheer size of the government stimulus or stimuli that are being sort of enacted around the world, there will be an uptick in capital expenditure. And I
yeah,
think a lot of companies will look, well, the supply chain that we had pre-COVID simply did not provide the adequate redundancy to withstand a crisis on the scale of COVID-19. So moving forward, we're going to have a more resilient supply chain. In part, that means reshoring manufacturing and distribution to more local vicinities. I mean, Japan has already I think released about a significant amount of money to basically encourage its manufacturers in China to reshore back to Japan. The US might try and do the same thing. A lot of the manufacturing that might be taken out of China will go to Vietnam or to Mexico or to other low-wage jurisdictions. There is going to be a big diversification of the supply chain, and at the same time, I think, I guess it's going to definitely, if you want to reshore, manufacturing back to China, you have to increase productivity to account for the increased wages. A country like the United States or Great Britain, or even some of the European countries, can't really hope to do that without investing significantly in automation. The United States, in terms of its install base of robots, lags significantly behind Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. If it wants to reshore manufacturing back to its jurisdiction, it's going to have to invest heavily in robotics.
yeah,
So, in order to improve the supply chain, in order to make it more resilient, you are, I think, undoubtedly going to have to see an increase in robotics in the two main markets where it's already growing the fastest, which is manufacturing and warehousing. Um, as for robots in public spaces, for cleaning, for material handling in hospitals, for last mile delivery, I think that this provides an incredible opportunity for testing. and there will be a significant uptick in it. It's probably not going to be, easy and straightforward. Any robot working in a public space is not going to be easy, but I think that COVID-19 will certainly accelerate the rollout of different vehicles, in the public space. The concept of the smart city, where you have drones for monitoring, you have autonomous vehicles for cleaning, or for scanning. It's been, frankly, hyped, and there's been, a lot of enthusiasm about it that's not necessarily translated into results. But I think COVID-19 really has the capacity to change that, and it won't be an overnight transformation, but we will see an acceleration.
Interesting. And in terms of like that future vision, then who's going to govern that? Like who actually sets the standards and the for robotics? Is it different location to location, or?
Yeah, so there's huge disagreement about this. Obviously there is a wider discussion about AI ethics and things like that. I think it's very hard to imagine that there won't be huge government oversight. I mean, this argument or question of who essentially sets the rules for robots, it really comes to the fore with the attempt to roll out increased drone deployments in the US. I mean, one way that the government or the FAA wants to do that is through remote ID. That would essentially require virtually every drone to have wireless connection. That is not a capacity that a lot of consumer drones, and especially drones on the cheap side, actually have. So you'd have a lot of hobbyists and a lot of consumers that would not actually have the capacity to meet the standards of remote ID, and so would largely have their systems grounded or made redundant and worthless. At the same time, that the remote ID is necessary for safe commercial operation of drones beyond visual line of sight. So there does have to be some tracking, and I think at the moment it's basically a dance between government and business. Hobbyists and some of the initial enthusiasts who really developed drones and to a less extent robotics are probably going to get considerably less input. But there is obviously going to be significant deviation between different countries. In China, the rollout of robotics arguably is going to be considerably easier. I mean, especially if you're self-driving cars, there really is no union pushback in China. So its vendors can essentially work. They can do testing in Shenzhen without much trouble. In the United States, unions have considering more power within the government structure, and so there's much more concern about employment, about reskilling, about the threat to jobs, and that's a dance that's happening in Europe as well. So I think the questions of regulations will really depend on the jurisdiction. I think also once the robots become less novel and more ubiquitous, I think they'll generate easier regulations. There will
that initial push, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, there will be issues. I mean, if you look at the Gatwick airport where we have one drone essentially grounded an entire fleet of commercial jetliners, and annoyed a great deal of people, and the British security services struggled to deal with it initially. I mean, that led to a huge amount of investment in counter drone technology. So most of these problems are created by technology also have technological solutions that can be incorporated into the security response. So there will be sort of moments that flare up and say that there's going to be huge challenges with robots, but this isn't going to sneak up on people and become ubiquitous in the same way that cars became ubiquitous. It's going to take a much longer rollout, and it's probably going to be piecemeal, and it will involve a lot of tug of war between government, private industry, and unions. So yeah, I think it's too early to say. But I think COVID-19 is definitely going to accelerate deployment initially.
It's kind of amongst all of the negativity, somewhat positive to hear that this is going to have a beneficial impact on the industry, or a industry, because everyone else is suffering and struggling, which is understandable. But if good comes of this, then I think everyone's won. But look, I really appreciate your time, and I'm very keen on mentioning that I'm sure you'd be open to it. But if you wanted to reach out and maybe discuss this particular subject in a little bit more depth with Ryan, we'll put a link to his LinkedIn profile attached with this actual video. But apart from that, look, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. I do really appreciate you sharing your insights, Ryan.
Oh, thanks, Lewis. It's been a pleasure being on. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, look, we're going to continue to run these webinars and podcasts. Again, anyone who wants to talk coming from the AI space about a particularly interesting subject that people are going to find relatable, feel free to drop me a message. Otherwise, have a great day, and thanks for watching.